effectively, Feesmustfall was and is a movement, because it hasn't been fully realized, for free, quality, decolonized education. For me, I don't think it's that young people in this country are not mobilized. I think it's that they just haven't quite found, and we haven't quite found what we're looking for yet. The fact that we have all of these small Indiana parties popping up here and there is actually not too uncommon, really.
No, but that's very
because it's part of the process,
but that's very good for the ANC politically, because it's the ANC's fodder. The plus one you have in and this
well,
is
the plus one for now is from us, but there is another argument here, and we must look.
But you
at
are
that
using,
kind
but you are
of
using,
element.
but using the most.
Woke up,
but use the most.
Created a law and decided all Asians will be kicked out.
Was that a democracy?
Well, that's another question.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines, and shot on location at Kurtuba Convention Center.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of In Conversation With. This evening I'm in conversation with a member of the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, ANC member, one of the upcoming and rising stars in South African politics, and a potential new leadership in the African National Congress, a new leadership in the country. Before I presume this position for her, let me welcome Fasiha Hassan. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Is that a good description of your potential future, of where you would like to go? I mean, you're already in a leadership position.
I would like to continue in the public service. So I think in some shape or form you're going to find me doing activism in community work. So perhaps, but I guess time will tell on the latter.
Political, I mean, public service. I'm pushing you.
Yeah, inshallah. Look, I would. In an ideal world, I would like to continue. It is a very difficult and flawed space to be in, but it is also a space. Yeah, flawed, definitely.
Flawed because?
It's not easy to maneuver. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. You know, in other industries, I think 1 + 1 tends to equal 2. In politics, 1 + 1 can equal a chicken, and you have no idea how you got to that particular point. But it is still fundamentally important, for me, especially because structurally there's space for change. And you want to be in a position where you can institute or effect the most positive change. And I would like to think that politics could still do that.
Your name became, I won't use the word infamous. I guess it depends who was reading the newspapers.
Depends who you ask.
I guess it depends who was reading the newspapers and who was writing the articles. But with Feesmustfall, that was something about change, isn't it?
Yeah, and fundamental change led by young people for young people.
What was that about in a nutshell?
Yeah,
I mean, we read it in know, but it's interesting to hear from someone who was in the middle of it and leading it.
Yeah, so effectively, Feesmustfall was and is a movement, because it hasn't been fully realized, for free, quality, decolonized education.
Is it a structured movement at the moment? Is there something like a Feesmustfall committee or Feesmustfall WhatsApp group between those activists who follow up on this issue?
It's not structured in that way.
Okay, I
think that's part of the challenge, right? That in any university space, there's a cycle of leadership, because you go to university, you study for those 3 or 4 years, whatever it is, and then you move on. But the reason why I said Feesmustfall must continue is because we still have a higher education system that is inaccessible. There have been major gains. NSFAS has been turned from a loan to a grant, and there's been an increase in the cap. All of that's important, but structurally speaking, we still haven't seen the kind of change we would have wanted to see, not just then, but even moving forward. So in a nutshell, it's around accessible higher education, but it was an important moment in South African history post-1994, because this was the first time you saw young people in this country galvanize around a common goal and really try and fight and pursue that goal, hopefully to the very end, but in a way that across political parties, across different generations. And there wasn't a person in their right mind who could say, even now, that we don't think education is a right. Of course, education is a right. It's not a privilege. And that, in a nutshell, is really why Feesmustfall is important, why it was important then, and why it's important even now.
Feesmustfall, was it a political movement? Was it led by politicians? Was it led by political leaders on campuses? Was it a true student movement? Was it hijacked in by the political entities?
It was definitely led by student activists and student leaders. At that time, we were definitely not politicians. Were there attempts to hijack? Yes. Any mass mobilized group, especially in the powerful way in which Feesmustfall was, there were definite attempts across the board, by the way, to capture the movement, but also to say, we want to direct where this goes, because there's some nefarious elements who try to make it go in a very particularly worrying factor.
Which was what?
A July 2021 unrest kind of factor. There were attempts at destabilizing, but there were also other people who said, these are young people who we want to nurture, and we want to actually translate that energy and that fire into something real in terms of real change as well. So it was difficult because there were all of these different elements playing a role, and we were only about 21, 22, trying to deal with these really difficult concepts at the time. So it's always a difficult thing for me to look back on, because
Really?
in hindsight, it's a perfect science, right? You would have done so many things differently. But with the information you had at the time, with the expertise, perhaps with the idealism as well, we made a certain set of decisions. And
were some of those decisions wrong, questionable, strategically? I mean, not necessarily that the protests were ethically or morally wrong, but you think
well, I think they were ethically, morally right to protest for this particular issue, right? Where I think it became difficult was around the hijacking, the attempts to redirect the movement to things that were not about education and how we managed those things, but also around how we took it forward. And this is a deeply reflective moment also for me, because that was 2015, 2016. We're not yet at the 10-year mark, but we're getting there. So one must say, why are we still in the situation that we are? And I don't take it as student leaders' blame or fault. No, I mean, this is a systemic issue. It always was. But I always wonder if handing over to that younger leadership at that time, did it actually produce the results that we wanted?
Did it produce any results?
Of course we did, of course. So there was, apart from all these commissions and all of that, NSFAS used to be completely alone. It's now a grant. The cap at which you can qualify for NSFAS is up to 350,000. Are there problems administratively with NSFAS? Yes, and that's why I'll continue to say that the objectives of Feesmustfall are not fully realized. Do we have free, quality, decolonized education? Not yet. That's why it's a continued process.
Violence in these protests and violence within student protests, that loses you a lot of goodwill, especially from parents like myself. Our children go to school, we pay fees, or we subsidize whatever, but the last thing you want to worry about is my children are getting victimized, my children are getting bullied, my children are being interfered with, etc. And the response we always get, and this is actually in all South African political parties, as soon as something goes wrong, it is, those guys weren't our guys. They were other people. They were third parties. They were, etc. What your response on violence on campuses with it emanating from the student community, just
so
on that issue?
Protest in its very nature is disruptive. Okay, so this idea that a protest must be in a neat little box there on the side, protest must disrupt a system. If it's truly a political voice against the current status quo, it must be disruptive in nature. And that's one of the reasons why, even in the early days, we had different discussions about how to protest. Historically in South Africa, we protest with struggle songs, you hand over a memorandum, you have a large rally or a march. And we'd done that many a times. We'd done all the research, we'd done all the negotiations that had failed, and we had gotten to a point where effectively all of the other tools before us were utilized already. We then said, well, how do we protest in a different way? How do we protest in a way that brings home the issue that we're trying to get across, which is, should these fee increments go through, the doors of higher learning will physically, not just like intangibly, actually be closed, particularly to the poor and the working class. And so that led us effectively to say, well, what happens if we shut down campus? What happens if we go to the university gates and we physically sit in the way? We just refuse to move as an important non-violent, passive resistance kind of element, but very importantly, it's still disruptive in nature. And I wanted to give this context because it's important to understand how Feesmustfall evolved, because that's what it started off as. And it was very difficult. We almost got run over by cars. People hit us, attacked us, called us hooligans. You name it, they did it. But the reality is, we then were able to mobilize in a way that is difficult for me to describe. So we started off as 20, 30 people. And people would come up to us and say, well, what are you protesting about? We'd done quite a lot of mobilization beforehand. And we'd say, well, there's this fee increment, this fee increase that's coming. And we don't think it's a fair one. We've done our research. It's too high for what the university needs. And that's what we're protesting about. And if I can tell you the amount of times a student said, actually, I don't know how I'm going to pay my fees, drops their bag, sits down with us. Of course, there were other people who said, no, this is nonsense, we don't agree. But the times that happened, I mean, we grew from 20 or 30 people to several hundred in a very short period of time, to several thousand within a few days. And of course, with such a large group of people, you are not always going to be able to control the narrative. You're not always going to be able to control what the outcomes are. And when people are so angry, so deeply angry about an injustice, it comes out in different ways. You know, some people will tell you, you must write letters, you must protest peacefully. But like I keep saying, protest in its very nature is disruptive. So were there people that took it too far? Of course. And we were very clear to condemn that violence. I mean, we said it. If you burn the library today and free education comes tomorrow, where are we going to study? What facilities are we going to use? But that's one element. There's another argument that must be made around the violence of the system. And I know it's a political, philosophical argument, but it's important to understand the psyche of people, that when that system keeps hitting you down, so you come from a very poor background, you've done your best and you are the exception to the rule. You are not the rule. To have come through a public education system that has created a situation for you to come to university, you're studying in a language that's foreign to you, you may get NSFAS, but your family is still poor at home. So many people send their NSFAS stipend back home. You don't have food to eat, you don't have access to textbooks, and then you sit in a university classroom with someone next to you who has a car, who has literally an air-conditioned life, every possible opportunity. You can't help but be angry about that. Does that justify violence? Not necessarily, no. But we must understand how deeply angered we were. And of course, we were young. We are young. We must be militant. We must believe in fundamental change. And we must shake everyone up, because if we don't shake you guys up, everything will just continue in the same fashion. And that's not something that any of us would actually want.
How did you get into the ANC?
So
it happened, and that is why...
even before Feesmustfall,
were you part of the ANC before?
I was part of the Progressive Youth Alliance. In fact, that's how I got my seat on the SRC when I became Secretary General, even prior to that. My parents were very involved in the anti-apartheid movement. At that time, obviously, the UDF, the ANC was later unbanned, very involved in local government issues. So I grew up in an activist home.
In an ANC home?
In an ANC activist home, yes. I think it's always difficult now, post-1994 and even 30 years onward, for people to identify as such. But it's true, I come from an activist home in that regard. But it's important to note that even prior to Feesmustfall, I was a member and a national leader of the Progressive Youth Alliance, which effectively is SASCO, the South African Student Congress. It's the ANC Youth League. I was very involved in the Muslim Students Association, which maybe we'll also get to. But that was my political home. And that's actually what got us our seats on the SRC and ultimately conscientized myself and many, many others to effectively start what we now know as Feesmustfall. So it has always been there.
Did your involvement, your leadership in the Feesmustfall, how did that impact your journey to where you are now as provincial MP?
I don't think I would have even been the Fasiha I am now had I not experienced and gone through Feesmustfall in the way that it did, with all of the police brutality, the trauma, the pressure, but also the deep sense of fighting for what's right, that deep sense about fighting against an injustice almost at all costs. But it's been fundamental to my journey. When I look at the seat that I have at the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, even today, I am the youngest across all political parties. I am the only one under the age of 35. And it's fundamentally because young people in this country stood up and said, yes, free education, but what next? Because we all know that higher education is it's a microcosm of society, but it's also a space in which the majority don't enter into. So you also as an activist want to say, well, how do I take that activism and go back to the ground? Go back to people who may never enter a university and hopefully change their life for the better. And that's sort of why I think it's so fundamental to my experience now, and also as a Muslim woman. There's an alternate universe where even the ANC, had my family not become involved, had my family or my parents not been conscientized in the late 70s, in the early 80s, that they may not have encouraged my activism. That there's this alternate universe where Fasiha is probably in a very different life. And I think it's important to understand that, because it's almost as if it was Allah's plan. All these different things that happened. People don't know this. I actually started at a law firm in Sandton just after Feesmustfall, after I graduated. And I lasted 4 months in corporate law because I just knew I was in the wrong place. And there was something inside of me that always said, this is not for you. And I always wonder about how Allah forces you into places and into spaces where you're meant to be, as difficult as it is, as challenging, as contradictory as those spaces are. Because sometimes I think to myself, especially like, those deep, dark moments in your mind or in prayer, or Allah, why? Why did you put me in these spaces where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, where you want to do the right thing, but it's so difficult to have that impact on the other side, because it's not student politics right now. It's far bigger.
I mean, you were an activist, Feesmustfall, you're an ANC MP, but in Feesmustfall you were technically fighting your own ANC, your own ANC system, your own ANC. I think Bladen Zamande was he the
he was the minister then and the minister now.
And right, Communist Party. So you're actually dealing with alliance partners as well in the bigger structural debate. What does that look like now? Because a lot of the battles that activists are fighting, and even ANC members are fighting, the challenges are with an ANC government. The challenges are with ANC failures. The challenges are with ANC structures, with ANC plans that have not been implemented or have gone wrong or whatever. Talk to me through that.
A few people struggle they think, well, how can you be a member of the ANC or have a seat in the legislature and still fight against the current system, right? And I think that's a very fair question to be asked. And I'll give you a few different points that I think are important. The first is that as a member of the ANC in an elected position, we have an even bigger responsibility.
Where's your constituency? Just for the record of the discussion.
So I'm from Ward 58. That's the Mayfair Fordsburg area.
Okay.
Remember, we have a party list system though. Yes. So I've actually been deployed. My parliamentary constituency office is in Centurion and Pretoria East. Okay. So even though I'm from Joburg, I service like the Lodium area. Okay. Not Attridgeville exactly, but that greater Pretoria East and greater Centurion area.
So when all those lights are going off in Lodium and that area.
Yeah, I know. When we want to throttle the city of
I will not put your phone number on.
It's available on the parliamentary website.
But I think the Lodium.
You could just Google it.
But I think the Lodium councillor is quite active.
No, he's very active. And actually, just as a side note, councillors like Naeem Patel, who I work very well with, are really examples of what we want our local councillors in leadership to be. Very involved, very hands-on. I can tell you, Naeem and I, we fight, not necessarily only with each other, we fight with the municipality all the time, but you'd rather have someone like that who really fights for their community, because someone like that you respect and you work well with. So that's incredible, and I think that's the kind of leader we need.
I just want to clarify, just for the interest, where your constituency is.
Yeah.
So when you were elected.
Right, so when I was elected, but also important to note, even though that was the constituency that's there, it's important to understand that I also didn't only represent a Muslim constituency. The seat that was given to us is actually more because of young people, young professionals, students who said, we want our leadership at the time to feature in Parliament. And that's why you see, not just in the ANC, you see it in the EFF, you see it through Vuyani Pambo, Nalari Chirwa, Nomphendula Mkachwa, you see it through a number of names, because the youth at that time, the youth were even youth now, but in 2019 said, but hold on, you can't have an incredible list without these leaders on them. So that's how we got to where we are. But relevant to how do we deal with this this contradiction, as ANC members, those who are elected even in those positions, I think we hold an even bigger responsibility, and we must be even harsher with the leadership because we belong to an organization together. So I don't see it as a not possible kind of element, and I don't see it as ill discipline, because the reality, and I say this publicly and privately, if we failed, we have failed, and we must be worthy of the vote. And I'll give you my view on higher education. I think that the Minister Blade Simande, should be replaced with somebody who's younger, who's more energetic, who understands the sector better, because the reality is we're not getting what we need out of that. And I'm consistent. I say this to the ANC leadership internally and externally as well.
Isn't what you are doing here now exactly the problem with the ANC? Is that there are numerous ministers who have failed. And then we find ANC cadres, deployees, MPs, etc., like yourself, who have this opinion: these guys are bad, we must remove these guys. And is that like the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that you guys are two sides of the same coin? That's the side of what represents what they are doing. And then there are people who whitewash.
Sure.
They say, no, we're going to get rid of them.
Sure,
and we'll fix this problem. They're actually the bad guys. I mean, so...
Sure.
So I mean, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, the ANC is a very broad church kind of organization. That's the term we use, but really it means it's got a wide variety of people. And let me speak to some of the tangible stuff we're doing to try and turn cabinet into a very different looking cabinet. As the Youth League, one of the things we've tried to pass, even at national conference most recently, that elected the current president as the ANC president, one of the constitutional amendments we want is that you cannot hold a leadership position over the age of 60. So you can be a member, but we're fighting to say that over a particular age, you can be a member, you can be an advisory role, but we don't think that you should be a minister. And the reason why we don't think that is because we have a society, a South African society, that is more like us, that looks and feels more like us. And one of the big things we're doing now, even in this upcoming 2024 election, and you've already started to see it in the voter registration numbers, we are working incredibly hard in communities to get young people to register to vote, which we've done a lot of good work on. But also, and this is apart from the ANC, I'm saying this generally now, if every young person of voting age in this country voted, we would turn parliament, legislatures on its head, and therefore we would turn cabinet on its head. So for us, this is not academic. We're not just talking about it. We are in communities every single day. Because remember, the constituency I represent, and that's why I said it's not just Muslim people, it's young people. They are angry. They are pushing us. They want fundamental systemic change. And in order to continue representing them, we must institute that high level, but also that, like I said, the broad level of change.
I was looking at the IEC numbers now a week ago. I saw that the registered voters, they've got 18 to 20.
24, yeah.
And they show on IEC, it shows from 18 to 20, then it shows from 20 to 29. From 18 to 20, the percentage of registered voters was something like just barely 1%.
But if you look at
20 to 29 was maybe another just under 10%.
But if you look at those that are under 35 that have registered, that's the majority of new registrations that have come through. So remember, in South Africa, and it's debatable, it is debatable.
No, these figures depending how you look at them.
But this idea that you're under 35 in your youth, the majority of these new registrations are that. And it's, of course, it's not been easy. I'll be very honest with you. Going into communities, knocking on doors, speaking to young people, even through social media and other forms, young people in particular are disillusioned. They're not apathetic. And I want to make this distinction because it's very important. Young people in this country, it's not that they don't care. It's that there's this deep sense of anger about what we were told South Africa should be 30 years later. We were told, work hard, get an education, you'll get a job, this will be your life. And there are many of these ideas that have turned out to be fallacies. And if you're coming from a poor working class background, of course you're angry. Of course, and it's not just an ANC problem. If you speak to young people, they'll tell you there isn't really a political party on the menu that truly represents what we want as young people. Now that's a very important statement that's been made, because it means that we need to do a lot more work, not just only as political parties, but as society, because the democratic project is in danger. Because if young people are saying that this democracy isn't what we thought it is, there's a huge, huge, huge thing. And it goes beyond service delivery. I'm talking now about that intangible feeling that feeling in our communities. It's that, these young people, they don't care, they're apathetic, they're only focused on themselves, instant gratification, they only care about TikTok. All of that's not true. Young people in this country are deeply political. They may not say they're deeply political, but they're the ones who are leading service delivery protests. Do an exercise. Go home to your Gen Z child and try and tell them things about mental health. They'll be very defensive about it because they understand that the world is different now. And they're understanding, for example, mental health is a fundamentally important thing. Whereas our parents and our grandparents, mental health was not really an issue that they focused on. Not to say they didn't suffer from it, but they didn't focus on it. So you're seeing young people across the world who are coming out and saying, I'm not going to work to be abused. Actually, no, I'm not going to do it. And I know it's shocking the working world, but this is that change that we're starting to see. So for me, I don't think it's that young people in this country are not mobilized. I think it's that they just haven't quite found, and we haven't quite found what we're looking for yet. And perhaps we are what we're looking for.
Have you found what you're looking for in the ANC?
I still think that the African National Congress, in all of its flaws, is the best option in terms of how we bring about change. Right now, our best option is to fix the ANC, fix government, and then ultimately bring about that change. I know that it's not necessarily a popular view, but one of the things I've also learned, even in my Feesmustfall days, it's actually not to be populist. That the level of work that is required in terms of non-racialism, non-sexism, in terms of the understanding of the state, the DA is not an option right now. Apart from their stance on Palestine, they are unable to really create a non-racial organization. The EFF is actually, they call themselves left-wing, but they're very much on the right, and they're pushing on an African nationalist idea.
But when you talk non-racial organization, if we look at the structures of the ANC and the structures of the DA, forget about the merits, whether they're good people, bad people, corrupt people, not corrupt people, whether they get along or don't get along with each other. I mean, the ANC has a president that left and started its own party, following what the DA probably did where their presidents left and started their own parties. The DA has more diversity in terms of racial diversity in the leadership.
But then we're not talking about the mass exodus of black leaders who've come out and spoken about their experience in the DA. So for me, the point here...
But the ANC has a president who started his own party. The ANC has Cope who started. We have Malema who started the majority. So people leaving a political party doesn't necessarily mean that the party cannot deliver. I mean, people leaving parties, people leaving a party, and I mean, if anything, it's interesting that it shows that they are black. How many colored people have left the ANC, started their own party, other than Marius Fransman, who's starting his party now?
First thing, we are allowed to do that, right? And I think that's one of the beauties of this democracy, that you can have a political affiliation, and if you disagree with the tenets of that organization, you can go and start your own thing, and you're safe. No one's going to disappear in the dark of night, as unfortunately you see in other African countries, for example. So there's a deep importance to that. But I think we're discounting the experience. Remember, there's different reasons why people have left different parties, right? And if you look at the consistent narrative of black leaders who've left the DA, they're saying the same thing. They're saying that there isn't space to breathe in that organization. That does not exonerate the ANC from its ability to continue to be a non-racial organization. I can tell you, as an Indian Muslim woman, who obviously identifies as a black person in general, that there's a huge problem in the ANC on that. But does that mean we run for the hills? Does that mean we wash our hands of the situation? No. It means we work harder. It means we go back into our communities, we remobilize. Our communities have historically been very, very active. Maybe not necessarily in the ANC, but if you look at the 1980s, if you look at society then, they were rather mobilized against the apartheid system. So it's actually in some ways an indictment on all of us, because now we're in a space where people tell me this all the time. Oh, I'm just not that political. It's not my thing. It's for you, And I understand that in terms of partisan politics, but you can't divorce yourself from your community activism. And I say this to a lot of people as well, that you don't have to be involved in a political party to effect change. You can go into your local school. You can tutor on a Saturday morning. You can find a local soccer club if that's what you're passionate about. Find ways to develop societies that not only the one you came from, but general society, because it's this idea that we've outsourced everything to the state. government is meant to do it, that in some ways we've lost what we all grew up with, this idea that we were a sense of community and that we'd look after each other and that we'd build society beyond the state, because during apartheid we didn't have that with us.
Excellent. We are in conversation with Fasiha Hassan. We'll be back after this.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines.
We speak a lot of national politics. Talk to me about provincial politics. First of all, what is the ANC's position at the moment as we're sitting now before the 2024 elections in terms of percentage? But what percentage is the ANC leading the province?
So the ANC in Gauteng in 2019, we got just over the 50% mark, 50 point something. That's where we're standing at the moment. And it's interesting because we have 37 seats in the legislature, which gives us that 50 plus 1. And I came in on number 36. I got in by the skin of my teeth.
So things are looking very, very... Or let me rather ask you, what is your assessment of going into 2024?
Look, Gauteng...
Are you feeling comfortable that there are potential coalition partners? Are you feeling comfortable that you could make it? What's the reading?
What's the vibe?
What's the vibe?
What's the vibe?
What are you aiming for? What do you think is reasonable? And what's worst case scenario?
Okay, so let's deal with Gauteng and then national.
Let's deal with Gauteng.
So Gauteng is always an interesting province. The majority of the population sits here. The majority of the voting population also sits here. I think 24% of the total number of people on the voters' roll are in Gauteng alone. Which means Gauteng is ground zero for any political party. Anyone who wants to make an impact in South African politics must do so here. Now, that means that whether you're in the ANC, the DA, the EFF, anyone, there's always going to be some amount of spice in Gauteng. And obviously for all of our excitement, we are in this province, and this is where we're from, born and bred. Look, the intention or the goal of the ANC, both in Gauteng and nationally, of course, is to be in government, which means to continue at a plus 50% point.
Do you have a target? Did the president call you guys and say, listen, this is your target. We are sitting at 50%. Work your backsides off. We need to achieve this.
Yeah, it's to be in government. Anything over 50%. I mean, I don't want to get into the thing of numbers just in case I get the number wrong and then later,
Were you guys ever reprimanded? Was there harsh discussion from the leadership to say, guys, perform?
Definitely.
Because I'll tell you why. Fakir Mbalula.
SG of the ANC.
He was the head of, I don't know if he's still the head of ANC elections, but he was head of ANC elections.
In 2019, not anymore.
But before that, he was head of ANC elections for I don't know how many elections. And the ANC has been regressing and regressing. And this guy is still in his job. At what point does someone say this head of elections is losing us elections? The point of that is the accountability within the structure. Say, guys, we are losing elections. You fired. But we still see the same faces in the system doing the same thing over and over. And if I was an ANC member, which I might or might not be, or voter, or might not be an ANC voter, I'd be like, worried. You're sending us the same people to do the same job, and you people are losing, and no one's getting X.
All right, a few things. The first is that the way this democracy, any democracy for that matter, is designed, it's never going to be a party in 2/3 majority. That, of course, was, the Mandela era, the Thabo Mbeki era. It was always going to decline. And I'm saying this because in any robust democracy, you never see a 2/3 majority. Never. So in some ways, the democracy that we have is coming to points of maturation, right? And that's normal. Also on the matter of coalitions, it's similar. If you read our constitution and how it was drafted, it does a lot to protect smaller parties as opposed to other constitutions. So in some ways, the fact that we have all of these small Inyana parties popping up here and there is actually not too uncommon, really.
No, but that's very
because it's part of the process,
But that's very good for the ANC politically, because it's the ANC's fodder. The plus one you have and this is
the plus one for now is from us. But I get the point that you're making.
I mean, this is very, especially in municipal politics, it's working very well for the ANC, and well done to the ANC. I mean,
But yeah, we'll get to coalitions now because that's a whole other conversation. Are we in a situation where ANC Gauteng, we're under a lot of scrutiny and we are being pushed extremely hard. People at home don't know this, but our anxiety levels are extremely high because we are working as hard as possible to deliver an ANC victory in Gauteng, through the Premier Panyaza Lesufi.
What are you doing differently?
I think we have different people now, and I'll explain, right? Okay. In Gauteng in particular, we have a very charismatic leader, Panyaza Lesufi, in truth. He is very keen understanding of people. Even when he was MEC of Education, I don't know if you recall, in 2019 when we had just created that government, he was promoted actually to MEC Finance. And the communities in South Africa, especially in Gauteng, said, no, hold on, no, you can't do that. We want him to be MEC of Education. There was a huge outcry. And actually, he then went back to education and continued another executive term there. But the point I'm making is this is a very hands-on leader. This is somebody who understands people, but also is very passionate about young people. The Nasi Ispani program that's currently ongoing around mass employment, particularly youth employment, is a big part of his tenure as a premier. So you do see different elements, and I will say this, we are under extreme pressures to perform. Fikile Mbalula is now the SG of the ANC. He's been elected to that position. He's no longer the head of elections. The head of elections is Mdumiseni Ntuli. But one thing in the ANC that you learn very quickly when you enter into the politics is it's never about the individual. In fact, you'll notice we never say I. It's always we do this, us, our, as a group, as a collective. Because the thing is that it can never be placed on one person's shoulder. It is a failure of all of us. And it is something that we all need to be doing something about. But of course, like I said, I always expected there would be some amount of decline. If you look at an American democracy, the Indian democracy doesn't really count. If you look at other ones, it's always one government's 51 or 50 point something, and then 49. And that's how mature democracies work. Whether they are effective or not is a different question.
What do you think? I totally agree with you. What do you think would be a good representation of what the ANC support really is in the country? If there were, what
in terms of what percentage?
Percentage in the representation, if they're nationally.
Look, I think nationally, and this is of course the plan, to get above 50%, and I think we will, in as much as it's been a very difficult past few years. Unfortunately, we're still reeling from the 10 lost years, inverted commas 9 lost years, and I take the criticism, it was still an ANC-led government, all of that, but I'm speaking as somebody who was brought in also as part of the cleanup, as part of, I know people are attacking cadre deployment, but if you read the document, it's quite clear you must have the qualifications. We were brought in as the young blood to turn things around. It's difficult, and one of the big things that President Ramaphosa has really championed is the re-injection of capacity into state institutions. So if you look at the NPA, if you look at the SIU, these are all, for those who don't know at home, these are all tools of the criminal justice system. And remember, these are independent organizations. This is very important. You never want a president or an ANC or a government to say, go and arrest Mohammed, go and arrest Fasiha. There must be an investigation, there must be due process, and all of these different institutions, even ones on sexual harassment, and the court system on that, we're actually introducing new courts to deal only with sexual assault, etc., etc. Those are quite key because that's been a big thing in terms of capacity, in terms of funding, but also in terms of saying these are organizations or Chapter 9 institutions rather that must run independently so that we never find ourselves in a state capture situation and so that a government can run efficiently regardless of who is in power. And that's an important point on the professionalization of civil service.
What you're saying is technically correct, but I mean, Chief Justice Mogoeng was appointed by President Zuma, and yet he found against President Zuma numerous times actually in President Zuma's tenure. So I mean, what President Ramaphosa is trying to do now. By the way, I'm not pro-Zuma, I'm just analyzing what you're saying, you know. There is nothing new. And 9 ways, I think people...
But there has been a hollowing out, right? Yeah. If you look at the intelligence service, if you look at, for example, the SSA, the police service, there have been a number of key institutions that have been hollowed out. And we can't discount that because the reality is that you can't create a successful state without certain things happening. And the next big conversation is also going to be around coalitions and how we ensure that regardless of which coalition is here or then, and there are serious plans actually already moving in place to legislate how we do coalitions, because there should be time frames. It can't be this horse trade off. I'll be in MEC, you be in MMC kind of thing. There must be a focus on service delivery. If you look at the past legislations that have been recently passed, actually, in fact, even now, the independent municipal demarcation bill is basically saying you can't hold political office and be in certain positions. So we are looking at a number of tools to professionalize that public service. And that was not the case during that different tenureship. But I take the point that it was still an ANC-led government. But remember, we have a different leadership now with a different thought process.
I think what upsets people, it's not there was 9 wasted years.
10, yeah.
Although, I mean, that's debatable how much it was wasted. I think what upsets people is that who it comes from. It comes from someone who was number 2 in this country and was the head of government business and so forth and so forth and so forth. And I think that is a problem that people have with the ANC, is that there always seems to be, quote unquote, a cleanup. There's always, we're going to reshuffle people. We're going to, I remember, I think it was during the 2017 or 17 municipal elections, or the
2021 or
no, the one before
2016.
2016, when there was a grand plan and they said we are going to deploy our top brains to municipalities.
But then we lost a lot of those elections in 2016, which, for anyone at home who thinks, and this is just a different point, sorry, for anyone at home, we've heard these rumors about whether it will be a free and fair election in 2024. I can guarantee you it will be a free and fair election.
Where are these? We've never had those rumors in South Africa
We've
before.
never. And
where are these rumors emanating from?
I think it's from very problematic corners of society. Former President Zuma is one of those people who are very unfortunately attacking what is a very free and fair election. I mean, the fact that we lost in 2016, anyone who can see the math can see that this is a free and fair election. I wouldn't be as stressed as I am if it was not. These are just different ways to show society that we have an effective democracy. The fact that we're having this conversation, that we can be critical of government, that there can even be talks, which I disagree with, of course, of what is South Africa post-ANC. I disagree with that, right? But there can even be those talks, and that visualization of a future shows the kind of robust democracy that we have. And I would argue that those who are trying to poke holes in the legitimacy of the process are people who know that the election outcome will never go in their favor, because people are not idiots. And I want to say this, South African society are not stupid. They're very clever people. So people who go up and say, if MK doesn't get so many seats or they don't get government, we'll bring this country to a stop. It's treasonous. It is absolutely treasonous, because this is a free and fair election. People will go to the polls on the 29th of May. We might be very heartbroken a few days later, but this is what we fought for. This is what the majority of the stalwarts in this country fought for, a free and fair election. Literally, the people shall govern, and that's what we've got. They may not always choose us. I said that at the beginning. We must be worthy of the vote in terms of service delivery, but there are too many of us in the ANC who will never allow this country to go down the road of rigged elections or nonsense in terms of other political elements.
That's very assuring.
Even if we lose the election,
that's very assuring.
Yeah, we'll come back. We'll say we're very sorry. We've learned the lesson. Young people will probably maybe then will be given space in the ANC to lead. Who knows? And then we go back to the drawing board. But what I can guarantee you, and I will put my life on this one, it is a free and fair election.
What is the ANC doing differently on the ground? So you're getting pressure from the top.
Getting pressure from everywhere.
I want to understand, as an activist, as a young leader in the ANC, as a young leader in Gauteng, what are you doing different on the ground in this election? Are you visiting more homes? You're printing more posters? You're having more community? What are you doing differently to ensure that you can win?
The ANC election machinery, and I don't think people fully appreciate this. It's huge. I didn't fully appreciate it until I got involved more fundamentally in 2016, but more 2019. We are the only political party with presence in every single community in this country. Whether that presence is high or low, that's another question, but presence in those communities. And I think one of the reasons why the ANC has witnessed decline is not because we don't know what to do, But because we haven't been doing what brought us into the position of leadership of society, which was conscientization of our communities, active in our communities beyond elections. So when there's an issue, I'll give you an example of young people, or people rather, who are in our communities. When somebody is raped or somebody is attacked, who's the first person they call? In the community. That's the kind of thing that the ANC used to do. And that's sort of the trying to go back to it. And I don't just mean this around street committees and ward committees. It's really about reinvigorating, but understanding who those community activists are and going back into that element, but also giving ourselves time. One of the challenges, and I do door-to-door very regularly, so we face the wrath
Are there
of
people who
communities.
Does door-to-door still exist?
Door-to-door still exists in different communities. Remember, it doesn't work in a gated suburb.
Of course
We have
not.
different types of events there. But in our townships, in our areas where people are very poor, this thing works.
Where do you go door-to-door? What's
I
your
was
areas where you go?
recently, so I'm deployed in Swane. So we often do door-to-doors in Tiraleng is one area, but we get deployed all over the place. We had a recent by-election in Ikuruleni as well. But it depends, right? Like I'm saying, there's a different segmented approach in each community. But one of the things that we are doing is we're giving ourselves a lot more time. People are angry, yes. They deserve to be angry, and we need to take that, and we need to take time to sit with people, understand those issues, but beyond that, get to a point of what do we do now? How do we assist you in this way? And for me, that goes beyond electioneering, because this is what the ANC always was, what it should be going forward, because we didn't arrive in government from the planet Pluto. We were in communities. We were on the ground.
You arrived from Venus, I think.
Yeah. Well, So the idea being that we didn't come from nowhere. We came from our grassroots level organizations. And even now, we are planning a number of different election work. And I can tell you, we're going grassroots level activists and saying, what do we need to do? What do you think? What do you suggest? Because also gone are the days where politicians think they know better. We don't. Our communities live in those societies every day, and they often know better than we do in terms of what should be done and shouldn't be done. This doesn't take away from like a national planning commission, all of that, but sometimes small things. I'll give you a good example. The Department of Agriculture in Gauteng provides tractors to smallholder farmers, but also subsistence farmers if you want it. And one of the things that was happening is that these tractors kept breaking down, they had to be replaced, etc. And this was a big budgetary issue. And when we went into the community meetings, the community said, no, hold on, just take a few of us, train us in how to fix the tractors, give us the skills, means we can add it to a CV, and we'll fix the tractors ourselves. We did that, and I can guarantee you that the process has been so much more efficient, so much more smooth. We've got communities with skills, the tractors are functional, people are able to do smallholder farming, and it wasn't, like I said, rocket science. This was a community who said, we know better, and we listened. Outcome.
In Gauteng, are you the token Muslim who is deployed to reach out to Muslims in Gauteng?
We have Tasneem Matara as well.
Yes,
they are
yes,
more
yes.
than more than one person.
Okay.
One of the things that I'll speak now actually to the Muslim community, we haven't been involved enough as community activists, and I don't mean this in the ANC alone. It shouldn't be so difficult to mobilize within a Muslim community because our Islam teaches us to be active members of society. It teaches us to fight for justice wherever we are. I'm bringing through a number of young Muslim people through the ranks who are coming with us and coming with me, but they're younger, right? We need to provide those spaces. But if I can tell you, sometimes it's like pulling teeth in our community. And that speaks much more broadly to the fact that we don't have enough Muslim representation. I don't mean this in government. We're technically overrepresented. But what I mean is that we should have more Muslim people across the board. And it's become very difficult because maybe our society and our Muslim community is not encouraging young people, especially young women, to get involved in politics. Because I can speak from experience. It's not, you'll get to the family event and they'll say, oh, are you finished now with this politics thing? As if it's a temporary element. Not that this is a fundamental part of my Islamic identity, which it is. When people ask me, how do I continue in politics? My activism is my Islam. because that's what we were taught. The Prophet ﷺ was an activist. He was a revolutionary. He was somebody who stood up against the status quo, right? That's what we've been taught as, in fact, being revolutionary, being an activist is a sunnah if you look at it. And yet we see communities who want to be insulated, who don't want to integrate with the masses of our people. And then we look around and we say, why are people not becoming Muslim? Why are we being isolated more and more? Because we're isolating ourselves in some ways. This doesn't take away from representation, but there is an issue.
Do you think that, and here's muddy waters, murky waters, do you think that that the majority or the majority expression of Islam in South Africa is a relatively conservative expression of Islam that has certain opinions on the role of women, the role of youth, the role of politics, etc., 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 and that has an impact on the way in which Muslims perceive women in politics, perceive people in politics, perceive political leaders.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that, and I don't mean it as a harsh criticism. I mean it in a way that we must evolve as well. If you look at the history, the community, and I'll give you an example.
If you're careful how you say it, because that's what must evolve.
If you look at the history of Islam, mosques were centers of organizing. We were once the leaders of the scientific world. If you look at decolonial politics, in terms of how we even interpret and understand Islam, we're not looking at that rich history of what brought us to the pinnacle of what we think Islamic history is, right? And now we think that, okay, we'll live our lives, we'll just continue in our small little community and that will be it, that's fine. But how do we justify that in our own Islam?
But here's some issues which, no matter how conservative one is or how liberal one is, which I think many people have issues with, politics and politicians and what's happening in the world, LGBTQ, even before that, let me retract that, the role of the family. It does not seem that the ANC or any political party in South Africa, I mean, I think the ANC, DA, the EFF, who between them have approximately 88% in parliament.
Sure, they have the majority.
Right, the three of them. So I actually don't know what the rest of these one-man parties are going to do when they get there, even post-election. The question is, they are from liberal to extreme liberal with different doses of extremity in the liberalism on different policies, right? Issues of family, issues of gender, sexual morality, sexual behavior, sexual conduct. These kind of issues are fundamental to how Muslims function, and it's a fundamental part of identity. So yes, we might look at a political party and say, wow, you're doing good work in Gaza. We might say, wow, you're doing good work in Palestine, you're doing good work in this. But at the end of the day, when I get a phone call and I get told, you know what, there's a LGBTQ toilets in my children's school, when I see a policy in the government that recognizes same-sex households, and so forth. And by the way, this is actually not the ANC, DA,
this
EFF,
is across the board.
So, I mean, sometimes it's not that people have a problem with a Muslim woman in politics, have a problem with politicians. Sometimes, and these people who have these opinions are all for justice in that. But sometimes we talk about these big philosophical issues and we say Islam was for justice and we did But they are bread and butter issues which form the core part of our identity, right?
But let's unpack that.
Do you think that political parties and Muslim participants in the political space are aware of these sensitive issues that are the core of the Muslim identity? Not to saying they're right, not to say they're wrong. I mean, this is how people choose to identify and live their lives, and they take objection to the way in which society is functioning. So people are not, we don't want to be part of this.
Look, of course, we come from the same communities, right? I come from the same conservative Indian Muslim community in Joburg, which is a very particular community as well. So I'm very alive to the different nuances, to the different things we agree and disagree with. That's one point. But I want to speak, starting off with this concept of the family. One of the biggest successes of the apartheid regime was the destruction of family units, right? You saw it with migrant labor, you saw it even with us in many ways, the falling together or tearing apart rather of families. And we did a very interesting thing as the Muslim community. We built society, we built community with each other, but we didn't actively exclude ourselves, right? There were the conservatives who said, and I mean now they won't admit it, but they told the activists of the day, don't rock the boat too much. During apartheid, don't rock the boat too much. Right? Now that's a very problematic statement because that is fundamentally anti-Islamic. It's like the Prophet ﷺ or his Sahaba saying, we're not gonna fight for black slaves. We're not gonna rock the boat too much. We're going to allow the killing of young girls who were buried alive at the time. We're not gonna rock the boat too much. So there's a very question that we need to ask ourselves here, right? And that doesn't take away from the fact that we are very open and okay, it's fine to be concerned about the LGBTQI issues, around different policies in the government, all of that. But that doesn't mean that we should dissociate ourselves from South African society. If you ask people, even in the Indian Muslim community, they're not going to go back to India to live. This is our home. This is where we've chosen to live. And we haven't been as involved as we should have. But I want to get to this thing about policies because there's an important point here. Some people think that we shouldn't live in a secular state. That is, in a state that is not governed by religion. I would argue that that same secular state is what protects us as Muslims.
No, I totally agree with you.
Circumstance. The Constitution protects us. We can have our azan as loud as we'd like, according to the bylaw, of course. But we're not subject to extreme Islamophobia. You have a government that has many Muslim representatives, but also who understands our issues, who doesn't go and say, all right, on the Bila bill, for example, we know there's major concerns. And those concerns, I know, last week there was a meeting with UCSA and the ANC and government. There's a number of direct access points that we have that we wouldn't have in other spaces. So I don't think that you would have that kind of level under a different government, firstly. I think it's because it's an ANC-led government who was also born from the same community that you and I come from. If you look at your Uncle Kathy's, your Amit Timals, your Fatima Mirs, all of these people came from our communities. We should be proud of them. And the reality also now that I want to put across is it's not un-Islamic to vote. It's not un-Islamic to be involved in society. How do you bring people to the fold of Islam? You bring them through your character, through your actions. When I look at my community work in townships, and I don't mean this as just giving some charity, I'm talking about genuine empowerment work, that's dawah. The person that I married was not born a Muslim. He became a Muslim based on watching our actions, our work and our activism in our communities. Those are things that we've forgotten. We've forgotten that part of who we are because we were always that part of society. It just seems that now we think that we exist in a small bubble, and we don't. We are a much bigger part of society than just the small bubble or blip in a greater community. Even though we account for less than 5% or less than 2% of the population, we are very influential.
In conversation with Fasiha Hassan, we are very influential. That is what she is saying. Let's continue this conversation shortly.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines.
Fasiha Hassan, I want to wrap up the conversation on Muslims in Gauteng. Do you by any chance have numbers for South African Muslims?
I would need to confirm this with Stats
I've asked this
SA.
to all my guests, and
it's funny you should ask because we're actually waiting for some of those numbers. But look, at the moment in Gauteng, I think we account for less than 2% of the population. But I'm happy that once the numbers come through, because we're already doing our election work on it, I'm also happy to publish that. And you'll see.
Please publish it on your
I'd
on
like
your
to do that.
Because it's something that I'm personally curious of, and I've asked all my Muslim guests, and I've got many interesting answers on that.
The Gauteng City Region Observatory, the GCRO, has also done some interesting research on that, and we are awaiting it because even though the numbers are small, and I said this just now, we're very influential. If you look at the population size that we occupy vis-a-vis our ability to influence political policy or the political outcome of even funding of political parties, all these different things, we are deeply influential in that regard. And maybe just before the break, I just want to say, one of the difficulties of when you disagree with a policy, if you don't come to the public hearing, or you don't email, or you don't say you're not happy, how does a state or a government know that a constituency is not happy with something? So that's why we have to be more actively involved.
I think part of my comment before that was to ask the question, are activists like yourself aware, and you take cognizant of the conservative nature of Muslims in South Africa, in terms of this is who they are, and this is the reason to their objections. This is the reason behind their worldview, and appreciate that as that is their identity, and not as an irritation.
Sure. No, I get the point that you're making, and I'm very alive to that, and that's why I said I come from the community. Okay. These are also discussions at the dinner table, okay, with greater family members, and it's okay to sometimes agree or disagree. But I think the point I'm making beyond that, it's okay whether you're pro or against, right? That's a different matter. Okay. It's about being active in society so that your voice is heard. That's the point I'm making. I want more Muslim voices to be heard in mainstream South Africa and mainstream society.
A big issue in Gauteng, I mean across the country, but in Gauteng it flares up very often, and it's the issues of foreigners.
Yes.
Xenophobia. But the interesting part is that a lot of the foreigners, when the issue name of foreigners comes up, it's our Muslim brothers in.
Oh, it's Afrophobic, yeah.
Afrophobic, and Muslim brothers from Somalia, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, etc., etc. That's the one part of it. The other part of it also is, I won't call it contamination, but now when there are grievances against these communities, a lot of the grievances, especially on social media, now goes over into traditional Muslims who've been here for hundreds of years, and so this, we also get the brunt of that.
Sure.
In terms of the pushback from nationalists to us saying, get out of here, the Afrophobic nationalists, the xenophobic nationalists, and so forth. And traditional Muslims also get a bit of that heat sometimes. Are you aware of this?
I've experienced it a bit differently, especially when there's issues. Look, I come also from Mayfair, Fortsburg. My nanny's from there, my mom's family is from there. So that's an area that is, in inverted commas, a hotspot for foreign nationals in many ways. There's a few points here. The first is there's an argument on documented migrants. And of course, there's another argument on asylum seekers, refugees, which are, of course, according to international law, we welcome. There's a process that must be followed, but that's there. The problem, I think, comes in terms of undocumented people, and we completely understand that they come from war-torn countries, etc. But there is a system, right? It can't be a free-for-all in any country.
But there's 100 countries between your war-torn country and South Africa.
Sure.
How did you get here?
Sure, and those are questions we must ask,
but
right?
That's questions
because South Africa,
but the question goes back again to your
it's actually because South Africa is one of the better countries, if not the best country on the African continent, in terms of economic opportunity, in terms of political safety, in terms of freedom of the press, freedom to protest. We have an incredible country on our hands. We forget that, actually. If I was in Cameroon and you and I had this conversation, you and I would be gone tonight. Nobody would see this show, So that's one of the reasons why people come here. But there's another argument that I want to make. And one of the reasons why it's so important for the ANC to have done its work and continue, and I don't mean this in terms of service delivery, I mean this in terms of, at the turn of democracy, there was a great deal of work done by community activists to start to try and integrate communities, right? We didn't all necessarily like each other. We had all fallen into these apartheid-like traps of you and us and them, etc. And there was a process that needed to continue to integrate South African society. And I think there's a much broader conversation, because no one's saying there's a white person from the UK, xenophobic attack. No, this is a very particular grouping of people who are under not just surveillance, but who are under attack. And part of it is because it's working class people who are competing for the same jobs, which is part of the problem.
But there's also an issue of critical mass. I mean, there's there's not like 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, and I don't even think there's maybe 10,000 or 20,000.
I think the problem is much worse than we
I'm saying that
to
I don't
admit.
think there's even 10 or 20, 30,000 Europeans, Brits or Americans who are illegal in the country. So I mean, it's also an issue of critical mass.
Yeah, but there's also
no
a
one will
question
go and
here
say.
and like I'm getting to, it's about classism as well. It's about competing for the same space. And that's part of where the problem comes in. And the reality is, until we are able to grow the economy and create jobs for the masses in this country, you will see these sparks up of xenophobic violence. Not to say they are justified or they are okay, but because the economy is unable to absorb working force from the South African population, forget before we even get to a foreign population, because we're unable to do that, it becomes this daily sort of thing. And I'm in communities every day. People are saying these things, and I haven't actually fully experienced this thing of, oh, it's because they're Muslim. They're not saying that. They're saying it's because they're Somalian, it's because they're Pakistani. Of course, there will be an overlap and an element there, and I can understand why there's fear. I can understand that. But that's also why you need a kind of government that says we come from a history where we have fought against this, and we will continue to fight against it in a way that, of course, balances international law, while we understand some of the issues of South Africans and their economic issues. But at the same time, we do have a problem. We have porous borders. We have an issue of people coming in and out. And it's not that we don't want people here. We do. I think there's an incredible ability of culture, creation or co-creation in terms of skills, etc. But we must be documented, and we must find ways in which we can understand what are those numbers, what's the contribution to society. If people want to be a part of South African society, they must also pay tax. Right? You want to make money, you want to do well here, no problem, but then pay tax. Let's help them. Let's use that money for public schooling, for public healthcare, for our roads that are riddled with potholes, for example.
In the Gauteng legislature, are you looking at anything, any legislation in terms of safety, security, policing? Are you looking at security? Are you looking at anything, or what are you looking to invigorate this process of dealing with illegal undocumented aliens?
So remember, like home affairs and immigration issues are more on a national competence, which means national government and national parliament tend to be the ones who are able constitutionally to legislate around it. But we are able to legislate and do a lot of work in terms of community safety. And under MEC Faith Mazibuko, there's been the Okai Molao, which basically, to our community members who don't know what it means, effectively it's a program that goes into hotspot areas. We do raids, we arrest people, and then we have a continued presence in that area to try and have targeted approaches on issues of community safety. But community safety is not just about putting more boots on the ground. We can put more boots on the ground in terms of police force, right? We're trying to do that with the wardens and all of that. But the problem is far more structural. It's got to do with what I mentioned economically. It's also got to do what you and I were talking about the breakdown of society, of familial homes, of not having the spaces where people belong, so they turn to crime. It's so much more structural.
To what extent is this a failure of South African foreign policy? South African foreign policy that is supposed to, I mean, a big part of foreign policy, of our foreign policy at least, is Africa and what's happening in Africa. And I mean, that has to be inward looking, and us being more part of safety and security in Africa, of course, assist and makes our position better. Foreign policy in terms of what is our foreign policy regarding these countries who have these huge amounts of undocumented. What is our Minister of Foreign Affairs telling these people? What are we telling the government of Zimbabwe? What are we telling the people? So the issue is, what is the impact of foreign policy on this? Our policing, our bylaws in Gauteng and in the municipality. So the question is, there are many other bigger issues, because I think sometimes we take a very soft, and we try to be tactful and say, people coming here, how can rehabilitate them? But at the end of the day, if I say, when I look at any official in this country, they want 3 months pay slip, a proof of residence, copy of ID stamped within the last 3 months, right?
Yes.
So I'm a South African citizen. I have like 3, 4, 5 grandfathers who've been here, and I have no problem providing that. I mean, I really don't want to hear that someone else must be looked upon in favored in any way just because he happens to find himself. I know I sound very xenophobic. I'm probably more aligned to Gayton McKenzie on this. But
Well, hopefully not, because Gayton's a Zionist. The Progressive Patriotic Alliance is unfortunately Zionist.
on this issue, and a lot of people are complaining about, because why do we always find so many justifications? You know, we would like to resolve this issue, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and a lot of people say, well, this was created by the ANC
I disagree with
because of the
that.
porous borders. I mean, who manages our borders?
Well, so let me deal with the foreign policy part of the question. I don't think foreign policy alone is responsible for the crisis. I think it's multi-pronged.
No, of course,
right?
of course.
Partly, I don't even know if it's more foreign policy. I think it is more around the borders and our ability to not just guard those or man those borders, but also in terms of home affairs, right? How do we regulate who's in the country, who's not? And then, of course, there's the safety and security issues that must be put forward. But it needs to be a holistic approach. And one of the problems we do, in fact, have is we have industries that are employing a lot of these undocumented people because there is obviously a supply-demand element here. If there was no one employing them, they wouldn't come or they'd leave. And there's a much bigger conversation here. Like, we all have people who work in our homes in various different capacities. Have you checked whether they're documented? Have you checked all of these different things? And I'm not saying or advocating for the mass firing of people, not at all. I'm saying that there's a bigger conversation, even in restaurants, right? Did you check those 3-month pay slips? Did you check all these different things? Because one of the things we've actually passed in the Gauteng legislature on policy is the Township Economic Development Act. And that actually does benefit areas in which not just Muslims, but generally people of color live in. It can benefit a Lens, it can benefit an El Dorado Park. And one of the requirements to benefit from these special economic zones that we've spoken about there is you must provide a South African ID. You must provide. Now, there are ways in which we can do this that don't send people running or packing, but it means that the spaza shops in our local areas. No, because there's international law and there's rule of law, both in this country and in the world, and we must fight to defend the rule of law. It's very important, right?
But that's our laws.
But there's both, right?
But we can make laws that sends them
if
running
somebody
and
comes
packing,
here and they're an asylum seeker, you can't chase an asylum seeker or refugee. It's like saying someone comes from Palestine, which, by the way, a number of people are now coming to South Africa, Palestinians.
But we will never have 300. We will never have 300,000 Palestinians here. We will never have 200,000 Palestinians here. I mean, Palestine.
So let me say this. It's a partnership process, right? You yourself, as a member of society, must not be employing undocumented people, number one. If you are able to see it, sure, you must report it. But also, we need to create this culture of saying, I'm registered with Home Affairs. I pay my tax. I'm a part of society. I'm a general part of South African society. Because when you divorce yourself, it's very easy to say, this person who works in this particular restaurant, you don't know. And of course, there's a humanity element here, right? You can't just send people
What about
packing.
the humanity of South Africans?
Of course, fundamental.
The humanity of South Africans is what important.
But why do we do this? Why do we say that the humanity of one human being is more important than another? Is that not what the Israeli Zionists do? That the humanity of their people is more important? The point I'm making here is that there's a balance that must be struck. Rule of law must be applied, due process, but we must be very clear. And Minister Aaron Motsoaledi, who's the current Minister of Home Affairs, has been very clear. There's been the revoking of a number of the Zimbabwean permits, which I know has been a controversial part in civil society, but understandable to some extent. There's also been a push around the borders and the SANDF. But you are also seeing a government that's saying we are going to be more harsh, not because we are uncaring, but because we understand that South Africans do need that support. But caring has got nothing to do with being legal or illegal. No, of course. And that's why the legislation we're passing, I gave you an example on the Township Economic Development Act. You must provide a South African ID or show that you are South African. The other problem is there's at least 10,000 people in South Africa who are South Africans who don't have IDs because they weren't registered at the beginning. But that's another conversation to be had. But Minister Aaron Motsoaledi is quite clear on this, whether you agree or disagree, but a balance must be struck. In any government, a balance must be struck. You can't go chase people. I mean, there's rule of law in this country.
Which we write. I mean, we can write laws to expedite deportation of illegal aliens. We can create those laws. And I don't mean to I'm not saying eject illegal aliens in a violent or an undignified or an illegal fashion. But I mean, we need to see movement on this. We can't say there's 100,000 or 200,000 or a million.
Sure, there must be movement.
And now and then 10 were deported.
Yeah.
20 were deported. We caught the bus with 30 or 40 Zimbabweans. we talk about hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. And
Remember, not all of those people are undocumented, right? Some people are allowed to be here with the right paperwork, etc. But I'm going to give you the example of what happened in Uganda with Idi Amin around this thing of laws. Idi Amin woke up one day, well, it wasn't a one-day process, and decided that Asians, including Indians, were to be expelled from Uganda. And that was a very problematic thing that happened. And I want to use this example because there is an argument on protecting South African identity and protecting the South African economy, which I fully support, by the way, on the economic levels. South Africans must be prioritized, no doubt. But there is another argument here, and we must look at that kind of element. Idi Amin woke up, created a law and decided all Asians will be kicked out.
Was that a democracy?
Well, that's another question.
And
the point is,
you just guaranteed us the ANC will not do that. So we are saying that. So we are saying the ANC must have. The point I'm making here is that there must be laws that are just, that can be tested under the Constitution, which protects... That are favorable to South Africans.
Of course. I've said that, right? But the reality is you can't go into communities, into townships, into areas and chase people, right?
No,
there is a police force, there is a rule of law, and there's a way in which things need to be done. Because what I would hate is someone to watch this interview and think, right, this is mass license to go into communities and expel what we call, I don't even like those words of illegal aliens. These are human beings. These are people. And whether we agree or disagree on how they came here, there's a process that must be followed. And that's why I cited this Idi Amin example, because there are probably Indians in this country who came from Uganda because one day a political leader woke up, a Gayton McKenzie equivalent woke up and decided, right, mass expulsion of people who are contributing to the economy and assisting. I'm just showing you that there's a way in which it must be done, and it must be calculated, it must be particular, and it must be long-term and sustainable, right? Because the last thing you want is to create social unrest in how you do things. You want to do it in a way that benefits South Africans, supports them in their businesses and in their opportunities, education, etc. But let me lastly say this. Civil society plays a fundamental role. And when government tries to take very important decisions and move forward on this issue, we are often taken to court. I'll give you an example, whether you agree or disagree. A circular was issued some years ago that at the beginning of the year in schools, especially public schools, South African children must first be prioritized for spaces. Then afterwards, whoever else is there. Equal Education, if I'm correct, took the Minister of Basic Education and the department to court. It went all the way up to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court found that you can't do that. So now, even in 2024, all of our classrooms were rather full, more full than normal, because we cannot turn people away. So you also need to look at that balance of how we manage our civil society partners and stakeholders, but at the same time manage some of these issues, because it becomes very difficult to act when you're constantly being taken to court, whether it's on an eviction, whether it's on the school, whether it's on the public healthcare system. And of course, there's a moral argument to be made. Like I've said, human beings, human dignity, of course. But it does become difficult to implement the laws you create when you're constantly in and out of court from different civil society actors.
I think you've articulated your position very clearly on that. What is it like as a Muslim woman in politics? I want to get into your personal life.
Hectic, man.
Really? I'm sure it's hectic.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what are the challenges, what is the... because the reason there are many young Muslim girls who might have an interest, and I'm sure this is your target audience. You are looking for more activists, more people to join, competently join the ranks of the ANC.
Definitely.
And I'm sure ladies from other minority groups who are also come from generally moderately conservative backgrounds.
Even general young women, right? Because we don't have politics, apart from racial dynamics, is historically underrepresented in terms of young women. There are not enough young women in the space. And there's a number of reasons for that, right? In many ways, how the system is set up doesn't make it easy for us to enter. But that's not a reason to not force through. If women MPs didn't fight to get elected, or before you even get there, if women didn't fight for the vote across the world, as difficult as it was, we wouldn't even be sitting here. Forget having a woman member of parliament, just for the right to vote across the board, whether you own property or not. And there's an important element in terms of understanding here that any industry you enter as a young woman, especially as a young woman from a marginalized group, you're going to have challenges. What's important is that we have the stamina and the resilience to fight, not just for us, but for the millions of young women who are going to come after us. And that's how I view it. I may have difficult days, but there are more days where I feel fulfilled. And there are more days where I wake up and I feel I can institute real and genuine change despite those difficulties.
What difficulties do you face as a woman in politics?
There's so many issues.
Yeah,
right. You arrive, and this happens even in corporate. You'll arrive at a certain time, the meeting will start at a particular time, but nobody takes into account that you will have had to done child rearing. There's this idea you must work double jobs because now you must be a politician, corporate, whatever, and also work at home. Part of the problem is we don't have support from our community, right? So you expect it to be a superwoman, to work a full day as whatever it is, politician, doctor, lawyer, accountant, and then still work another full day in terms of you the only one who's carrying the housework, who's carrying the child rearing, etc. So that's the first thing. We need to do more support from our community level. But we also have to normalize that it's okay to work and that it's okay to have good and bad days. I've come across a lot of young people who, and I mean this across the board, who encounter some challenges in a career and then, nah, I'm packing up, that's it. This is life. It's not always going to be easy, and we have to continue to fight those processes to enter. Another difficulty is the way it's set up in terms of timing, in terms of, for example, if you're an MP in Cape Town, you spend some part of the week in Cape Town, then you must come back home to your constituency. It becomes difficult to raise small children. So we also need to have within government, within parliaments, childcare services. We need to have different types of support of schooling, but we also need our families and our colleagues to say it's okay. You know when a woman needs to leave a meeting for something that happened at school, for example, everyone's like, oh no. If a man does it, oh no, what a good dad. He's picking up the kids from school. What an active father. So it's those double standards that we need to really take and remove. But one of the ways we do that is we normalize women in the workspace. We normalize having people there. So that's a very big part of it. But the other thing is, the more of us that are there, the easier it becomes. Right? I fight about halal food all the time. Now there's halal food at every single meeting, every single event I go to, everything's sorted.
Are there any challenges that you, in your person, that are specific to you, like any interesting things that happened to you that illustrate this in your career, as a woman, that happened to you because you are a woman in politics, in your political party, in your career, in
any space, women are objectified.
Okay.
Especially young women. So you have to set very clear boundaries. That's quite normal. Unfortunately, it is what it is. I even have friends who are in corporate who have to do the same thing. So that has happened. But there's also another element of extra expectation on us as women. So you can't be as tired as everybody else. You can't be as annoyed. Say you have a bad day. There's less space for you to have those things. And that's been difficult because there are days you just want to come home and cry. And it's okay to do that. You're no less a feminist, no less a woman leader when you have difficult days.
How do you think you are received in the Muslim community as a woman activist?
I think it's mixed. I get some really incredible support from family and others as well who really see the value of having a Muslim woman in the space. And I get a lot from other people who say Muslim women have no space in politics.
What are this hate mail, comments on social media?
Yeah. Sometimes we get that.
What type of?
I sometimes get comments on my social media posts, all of that. I've recently married somebody who reverted. There were lots of questions about that. But the reality here is that there is a deep sense of ownership of me as Fasiha, as in the Muslim community. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. But the real big point here is around agency and choice. And sometimes we forget about that. We forget that even though you represent a community, you're still a human being. So you'll get a call in the middle of the night. There's an issue, a shack fire, for example, or some particular thing has happened. And that's across the board. Whether you are black, white, colored, Indian, doesn't matter. Those calls are going to come. But it's about how you balance it. And the other last point that I do experience is that sometimes I think people think I'm a robot that can work all the time. I mean, I do work every day. I work literally 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. But there are some times where you're like, I'm just so tired, or I just need a moment, or I just want to be with my family on Eid. Things like that, that I think sometimes people don't really understand because you are public representative. And I mean this even in the Muslim community, or even just at a family gathering or social gathering. Sometimes I do want to just talk about the most recent episode of whatever we're watching on Netflix, you know. I don't always want to talk about politics, even though that's what I love, that's part of who I am. So sometimes it's thinking that I'm only my political personality. I'm also just me as well.
What other parts of your personality is there? Are you into paddle? My children are all,
but I'm
my
terrible.
children are all playing paddle. I haven't catched
like
it yet.
paddle, but I'm not very good at it. I've joined a running group, so I'm trying to be more active. But I'm also like a nerd. I really like Harry Potter and Star Wars and all of those things. I love reading. I'm also like wanting to get into like watercolor painting and weird things like that because it helps me. It helps my mental health. And most recently, I've been exploring who Fasiha is beyond just the politics, which is a fundamental part of who I am, but it's not only who I am.
Post 2024, where do you see yourself? I mean, you're running for office, of course.
Yeah, inshallah.
Inshallah. On national or provincial, or how does that work?
Well, actually, we are awaiting the actual details. All the different political parties are coming up with their lists. So we don't know whether we'll be on provincial or national. I've thrown my hat into the ring for both. Allah knows best. I actually don't know what's going to happen.
So Gauteng might lose you.
Well, we don't know. I've put my hat in the ring for both. So Allah knows. And I'm actually literally in the process. I'm like literally making dua. Whatever's meant for me will be. But I'll give you an ideal scenario. If my duas are answered, I would like to come back. To serve in public office.
In Gauteng?
Either in Gauteng or in national parliament. 5 years sounds like a lot of time, but it's not. We lost a lot with COVID and there's a lot we still need to do. And we need more people who are not corrupt, who are fighting actively against those who are corrupt. And we need to develop that critical mass on the one side. So I'd like to serve. If not, I'd probably do a master's. I actually still want to do my master's even if I get re-elected. Inshallah, it would be nice to do that. If not, maybe I'll come work for CII. Who knows? Maybe I'll put in a job application. But I think I'll probably take a few months off to continue with my community development work, my activism work, go back to what brought me here. And lots of dua, because one thing I did learn over the last 5 years, if something is in your taqdeer, Allah will open up the way. And if that's for me, it will be. And if not, it will be heartbreaking, but we rebuild. And inshallah, we'll come back in the future.
In the future, where do you see the ANC? Whether you're part of it or not. What do you see the future of the ANC? I mean, you spoke a lot about the re-injection or the injection of young ideas, young people, potential new policies, new ideas, accountability, which I hope you will be part of it, inshallah, from this interview.
I hope so.
If there are more people like you in the ANC and you're true to what you've said, the ANC or any political party will be great if you join it.
Inshallah. We'll make you my chief guy who talks to everybody.
Oh no. Oh, what do you see? What do you see the future of the African National Congress? Realistically, what do you see the dangers for the ANC in the next few years, and what are the opportunities for the ANC?
So I think the ANC will remain the largest political party in this country for a long time. And I don't think that's shocking. We see a very negative side of the ANC, but we also don't see the positive side. So I think there is going to be that. But the reality is here, and I've said this both publicly again and privately, and I said it even at the opening of the national conference last year. I said, if the ANC doesn't evolve, we die. Evolve or die. Those are the options. And right now you're sitting with a leadership who's trying to evolve. It's too slow. We need to move faster. And if we don't evolve, we will continue to lose support, right? But if we do, if we read the moment well, if we get the right people in positions, we get younger people, but people with the right types of qualifications and thinking, and really root out this issue of corruption, there could still be a future. Gone are the days, however, where we're going to see 60% or 60%. No political party in this country's future will ever get that. And I don't think so, because we also don't want it, right? We want a robust democracy that pushes. Coalitions are unstable. We need to stabilize them. But that's one element. But I do think that there's space for some moral regeneration. That might also happen There's a chance that one goes into an opposition bench and then you become a moral fiber against a DA-led government, which I doubt is ever going to happen. I think they've scored their own goals. I think what we're going to see is the popping up of many different political parties, different amalgamations, different coalitions, but I do fundamentally believe that the ANC will still remain the largest party.
What are the opportunities for the ANC?
Many opportunities in terms of that rebuilding. One of the views of a number of different people is that the ANC needs to, dip a little bit in order to do that rebuilding, that regaining. But I do think there's going to be opportunity in terms of young people and in terms of people who deeply care, not just about the ANC, about the future of the country, the future of our cities. You're seeing so many people in different parts of society put up their hands and say, I don't want to be a part of a political party, but I want to be involved in some shape or form. And I think there's opportunity there for the ANC to go back to what brought us in, which was that community level of activism, and back into society, being that first point of call.
Fasiha Hassan, there is the camera. You have 1 minute to talk to whoever you want to talk to about anything you want to talk to. The camera is yours.
I know it can be very hard. Living in South Africa, seeing what we think is a very bleak future, so many people wanting to immigrate, wanting to leave. But the reality here is that we have not just a beautiful country in terms of landscape, but in terms of its people. If you looked in the late 1980s, so many activists didn't think that we'd get freedom. We've overcome so many different impossible scenarios, and this is another one of those. But it's going to take all of us. It's going to take the best people in different parts of our society rebuilding our communities, rebuilding the state, rebuilding the public sector. But there are enough of us, myself and yourselves included, who are willing to dedicate the better part of our lives to a better South Africa, to a better society. And that's really the message I want to put across. I could be anywhere in the world. I could have any work opportunity. I'm not trying to be arrogant. The point I'm making here is that I choose to be here. I choose to be in the state. I choose to be in the public sector because South Africa is an incredible place and it's something that we can do hand in hand for a better future.
Fasiha Hassan, Jazakallah khair for being in conversation with us. And I hope to see you in government post-2024, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Allah
Thank you very much.
Shukran to you. That is Fasiha Hassan. And thank you for being in conversation with us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines, and shot on location at Cortuba Convention Center.